merci d'être là, en présence, en public. Ça fait chaud au cœur de voir du monde dans une salle. Je rappelais à quelqu'un en coulisses que la dernière fois que nous avons eu l'occasion d'organiser véritablement à l'école urbaine un événement en public, c'était il y a 2 ans, presque jour pour jour, au début de ce qui ne s'annonçait pas encore tout à fait comme une vague pandémique mondiale, bien que nous ayons eu un atelier lors duquel nous avions pronostiqué l'apparition d'une pandémie mondiale. Et depuis 2 ans, nous avons été sevrés de moments où nous pouvons vous rencontrer. C'est pourquoi nous sommes très heureux d'être ici au RISE pour la semaine, pour cette semaine d'événements, de discussions. Nous n'appelons pas ça un festival, mais une école ouverte sur tous les savoirs anthropocènes, donc pour cette 4e édition de À l'école de l'anthropocène, organisée par l'école urbaine de Lyon, avec le soutien du laboratoire d'excellence Intelligence des mondes urbains et de l'ensemble du dispositif de l'Université de Lyon. Je vous remercie d'être là et je remercie tous ceux qui nous suivent en streaming, puisque nous avons évidemment mis en place toutes les conditions pour que nos activités, à partir de 17h le soir, soient accessibles en streaming. Et ensuite, d'ailleurs, je l'annonce pour tous ceux qui nous écoutent et pour vous qui êtes ici, il y aura disponible des podcasts, vidéo et audio, puisque nous avons également une programmation radio qui dure toute la semaine, chaque jour, avec à la fois des débats, des conférences, des entretiens, des interventions, et puis également des playlists musicales qui ont été faites par quelques-uns de nos invités. Mais vous avez le temps de découvrir la suite de cette semaine, puisque nous commençons juste. Et pour commencer, il nous faut un petit mot officiel. Nous sommes très contents d'être à Villeurbanne. Notre présence s'inscrit dans le cadre de notre partenariat avec la ville de Villeurbanne à l'occasion de l'événement que constitue le fait que Villeurbanne est la première capitale française de la culture. Villeurbanne est donc capitale française de la culture 2022. La thématique retenue est place aux jeunes et il nous a paru absolument indispensable de participer à cet événement annuel. Et c'est avec grand plaisir, et nous sommes très honorés en même temps, à côté de ce plaisir, que j'accueille Cédric Van Styvendael, donc qui est maire de Villeurbanne et qui souhaitait dire quelques mots à l'ouverture de cette semaine, en sachant qu'il reviendra à la clôture pour vous parler plus longuement d'un certain nombre de points qui lui tiennent à cœur. À toi, Cédric.
Merci Michel Lussault, bonsoir à chacune et chacun d'entre vous. Je salue bien sûr Alondra Nelson, dont j'ai le privilège de la voir en retour. Vous allez bientôt la découvrir sur l'écran, mais moi je la vois. Et juste le plaisir de vous saluer et vous remercier infiniment d'ouvrir cette séance aujourd'hui. Michel l'a dit, j'ai très peu de minutes parce que vous êtes venu écouter, ou alors vous êtes connecté pour écouter Alondra Nelson, mais je voulais quand même vous dire que, comme vous, j'ai commencé par de la sociologie. Alors certes, je n'ai pas fait Columbia, mais en tout cas, ça m'a énormément appris et je vous remercie infiniment d'être avec nous ce soir et avec l'école urbaine de Lyon. École urbaine de Lyon qui organise sa semaine de l'anthropocène à Villeurbanne. Les temps changent et c'est bien ainsi. Saluer les élus qui sont présents dans la salle. Je vois Agnès Touvenot, Stéphane Friou qui sont là avec Bernard Sevaux qui participent à l'organisation de cette capitale française de la culture dont, avec Stéphane Friou, nous avons souhaité faire en sorte qu'elle laisse une place importante à la culture scientifique. Et donc c'est bien tout naturel que nous accueillons à la fois cette semaine de l'anthropocène et l'ensemble des travaux qui vont avoir lieu pendant cette semaine. Ce que je voulais également vous dire, c'est qu'effectivement, on est très fiers à Villeurbanne d'accueillir cette semaine de l'anthropocène et que, à titre personnel, moi, je suis extrêmement convaincu de l'importance, en fait, de tout type de savoir académique et encore plus convaincu dans les temps si troublés que nous vivons. J'ai tellement peu de temps que j'ai même pas pris le temps de saluer Vincent Véchamp du RISE qui nous accueille en ce lieu. Mes excuses, Vincent, et merci d'accueillir cette semaine de l'anthropocène. Il faut juste faire quelque chose pour le chauffage dans la loge, sinon après on a un problème de voix. Donc l'importance des savoirs académiques, dans des moments si troublés, et puis surtout dans des moments où finalement il y a eu une forme de déconnexion extrêmement forte entre l'exercice du pouvoir politique et globalement le mouvement des idées. En tout cas, c'est une analyse analyse personnelle qui m'importe d'essayer de combattre dans ces moments particuliers que nous vivons. À la fois cette déconnexion et puis aussi peut-être une forme de désarmement intellectuel, non pas que le personnel politique français ne pense pas. D'abord, ce serait prétentieux d'imaginer que je le fasse. Moi, ça fait à peine 18 mois que je suis élu et comme je le dis assez souvent, nous n'avons encore rien fait, donc on a tout approuvé. Mais par contre, il y a la vraie conscience d'une forme d'urgence à réarmer intellectuellement ce que nous proposons pour nos territoires, nos pays et plus globalement pour cette planète dont on sait pertinemment qu'elle est particulièrement menacée. Et puis l'autre élément, je crois que c'est aussi la nécessité finalement d'un effort constant de la pensée, de confronter des lectures du monde qui divergent certes, mais de ne pas les instrumentaliser, de ne pas les caricaturer et de retrouver finalement tout simplement de l'espace pour partager ensemble ce qu'on imagine pour l'avenir et ne pas se résoudre finalement à faire en sorte qu'il y ait d'un côté un monde qui pense et de l'autre côté un monde politique qui finalement caricature les propos, essaye de faire du buzz sur les réseaux sociaux plutôt que d'essayer d'outiller l'humanité tout simplement pour assurer sa survie et celle de la planète sur laquelle nous vivons. Très modestement, Villeurbanne a été une ville qui a toujours essayé cela autour à la fois de son ambition de socialisme municipal, mais surtout sur son ambition d'essayer de raccorder finalement deux choses, à la fois le lieu de l'expérience et le lieu de la pensée. Et c'est dans cette ville une tradition historique. On discutait tout à l'heure avec des intervenants que vous allez voir à la table ronde à 21h qui disaient qu'est-ce qui se passe sur les universités populaires, pourquoi ça n'existe plus. Ici on retrouve dans les archives du RIS qu'il y en avait en 1937, donc vous voyez c'est important d'avoir cette capacité de laisser de la place à la pensée à la fois universitaire. Et je crois que pour résumer finalement le propos de Villeurbanne, c'est une terre qui relie le dire et le faire et qui essaye de laisser en permanence de l'espace à la pensée. Laisser de l'espace à la pensée, c'est ce que je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous pour cette semaine, en tout cas de travaux. Michel Lussault a la gentillesse de dire que je reviendrai conclure. Bien sûr, nous allons suivre aussi ces travaux par les différents canaux que vous proposez, parce que je crois qu'on a un besoin profond de réenchanter finalement le monde dans lequel nous vivons et de sortir des ornières de post-vérité dans lesquelles on essaye de nous enfermer au quotidien. C'est un travail de longue haleine auquel chacun doit prendre sa part. Merci Michel, à vous et votre équipe de le faire. Merci Alondra de nous partager avec nous ce moment si précieux. Je laisse la parole à Michel Lussault.
Merci beaucoup, cher Cédric. Et les mots que tu as prononcés vont résonner, je pense, avec ceux d'Alondra, qui va apparaître en principe à l'écran, en tout cas en streaming, mais aussi dans cette salle. En tout cas, je le pense. Alors, c'est la magie du direct, hein, donc des fois, tout ça est un peu plus long que prévu. Je vois Alondra, la voilà, bonjour, bonjour, voilà, la salle vous voit, et j'ai le très grand honneur, et nous avons le privilège de recevoir Alondra Nelson, qui nous parle en direct de la Maison Blanche, à Washington, puisque Alondra Nelson aujourd'hui est directrice adjointe pour la science et la société à la Maison Blanche auprès de Joe Biden dans le bureau de la science et de la technologie, le bureau des politiques scientifiques et technologiques auprès donc du président des États-Unis. C'est donc un immense privilège pour nous que d'avoir Alondra Nelson qui va nous parler de son travail et de son approche, en sachant qu'elle est la première personne à être dans la position qui est la sienne, puisqu'elle a été recrutée par l'équipe du président Biden en tant que sociologue. Alondra a un très impressionnant parcours académique dans les universités américaines. Elle a été professeure de sociologie à l'université de Columbia. Elle est actuellement professeure à l'Institut d'études avancées de l'université de Princeton. Donc c'est une scientifique, spécialiste de sciences sociales, qui travaille en particulier à la compréhension de la façon dont un certain nombre de progrès scientifiques, et notamment médicaux, viennent s'articuler avec des problématiques sociales. Elle travaille notamment beaucoup sur les relations entre les sciences et les inégalités sociales. Elle a beaucoup examiné la façon dont un certain nombre de savoirs scientifiques pouvaient accentuer, voire produire des inégalités de genre, des inégalités raciales, des inégalités sociales. Et c'est à ce titre qu'on lui a demandé de venir à la Maison Blanche pour porter un intérêt tout particulier à cette dimension qui est souvent oubliée dans les bureaux de politique scientifique, c'est-à-dire ce que les sciences sociales peuvent apporter à la compréhension des sociétés contemporaines dans leur rapport à la science. Alors, Alondra, merci beaucoup d'être là. Elle va nous présenter un peu sa vision et son travail pendant un petit quart d'heure, à la suite de quoi je lui poserai 2 ou peut-être 3 questions. Et puis ensuite, je vous rappelle qu'à suivre, nous avons la première table ronde de cette semaine qui sera consacrée à la problématique de l'habitabilité de la planète Terre. Alondra, c'est à vous.
Thank you, Michel, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to join you here all today. Welcome. Greetings from Washington, D.C., where it's the afternoon, but good evening to all of you there. I'm so glad to be a part of the wonderful idea of the open school. Openness and accessibility to information is what we need to live well together and to thrive together. And it's really encouraging to see this modeled at the open school. A word of thanks also to Mayor Van Styvendael, a fellow sociologist. I'm learning for your insights and for your leadership. And thanks as well to Cédric Van Styvendael, an organizer for this gathering, who's been a longtime friend and collaborator, and to all who worked so hard, including the translator that's working with me to bring us together this evening. So I'm honored to be speaking at this gathering, both as an academic and as a representative of the Biden-Harris administration and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the United States. My office is called OSTP, and the name at the team at OSTP is charged with advising the president on issues of science and technology. We work with agencies and departments across the United States government to ensure initiatives, policies, processes, practices that make it possible for every person in the country to take advantage of groundbreaking research, to benefit from critical innovation, ranging from health and environmental quality to our shared prosperity. Like many of you here, I've spent most of my time, as Michel suggested, in the academy, in my case, studying the intersection of science, technology, and our social fabric. And in my work, I've been, as a researcher, investigating how science shapes the world we inhabit and how societal context in turn shapes science and technology. And it's that work and those experiences that have really given shape to the perspective that I bring to public service. And really embedded in me a conviction that science and technology must be tools to make lives better, safer, and fairer. Last week marked the first year of the Biden-Harris administration. And in this year, I have witnessed up close, firsthand, this particular idea come to life, which is this, that democracy, like science and like research, is a process, that it is never quite realized, never quite finished, but always striving to perfect itself. And indeed, things like the open school that you're participating in Lyon are part of this democratic process and part of the process that we must commit ourselves to thinking and debating and speaking with others about the world that we want to have in ways that we hope pull us closer to our highest ideals for our global community. When we stepped into office last January, We knew that there was a gap between these ideals and the way that science and technology were developing. And we knew as well that the bonds of trust in government and science had worn thinner and thinner in recent years. We knew that core values of equity, justice, and integrity were too rarely reflected in the science and technology that underpins our daily lives. We see this in a few things. We see this in the unprecedented access we have to data. Data that at its best tells our stories in bright and vivid colors. But too often, that data and that information is being abused to track people's movements, to evict them from their homes, and to threaten their employment opportunities. We have powerful technologies, from artificial intelligence to genomics, tools that can help us answer important questions about the world and do important things in the world. But too often, the algorithms that drive these technologies are plagued by bias, unchecked and unregulated and programmed to exclude. And we have the tools to cure disease, to prevent human suffering, but too often those tools are out of reach. These are the kinds of inequalities that are unfolding in your country and in mine. And these are the kinds of injustices that are unfolding in the lives of the most vulnerable among us in particular. And it really falls to us as scholars, as citizens, to solve these problems. Because when we have the ability to alleviate suffering in the world, but do not, this isn't a failure of science, it's a failure of our political and social imagination. When we can break the bonds of oppression for others in the world, but choose not to, that's not a failure of engineering, it's a failure of conscience. And part of what brought me out of my academic world and into office was really recognizing that these tensions are the beauty and the burden of this particular historical moment. And the understanding that what we do now, how we resolve these tensions, our ability to do better in the world with the work, the political and social work it takes to do that. How we resolve that tension is a referendum on us as a global community. It's a question of who we are and who we want to be as a global society. The core of our science and technology policy vision in the Biden-Harris administration is this. We are building a science and technology policy that sees solutions through the eyes of the vulnerable and sees innovation through the lens of those who have been most damaged by it. We're fighting to get technological development right, to bring development out of the shadows and into public view. My remarks today provide a little bit of a roadmap of what we've been doing over the last year to begin to restore trust in the institutions of government and science, and to do a kind of equitable science and technology policy that takes centrally the issues of equity, of vulnerability, and of marginalization as part of the work of our office. Our efforts to foster equity and trust in science and technology have proceeded in a few ways, including by protecting what's called scientific integrity, which I will say more about, and also by ensuring that data-driven technologies work for all of us. This work began in the first week of the administration in January 2021, when President Biden signed an executive order declaring equity as a whole of government priority on his very first day in office. So the language that you hear about in the Biden administration about equity is really the kind of cornerstone of all of the work. And so much of the work really issues forth through this value and this principle. In the same week, President Biden also issued a memorandum instructing us to help restore trust in government by shoring up policies and practices around scientific integrity, and which in the United States really refer to evidence, analysis, science in government and for the work of governance that is not interfered with, that is free of political interference. This presidential memorandum called for the creation of a scientific integrity task force and directed every part of the United States government to safeguard against interference in science and to embrace evidence-based policymaking with an understanding that there's lots of different ways of gathering evidence. Over the last year, the White House Scientific Integrity Task Force, which I oversee with my colleague Jane Lubchenco, engaged government, civil servants, government scientists, and the American public to better understand how we can prevent political interference in the work of science and evidence making. This task force reviewed policies and practices across government, including rules and guidelines of conduct, forms of communication, and the effectiveness of the forms of use of evidence and science. A big part of this work was listening to the American public. So you're here at an open school. The sort of culture of this kind of engagement is in some ways much more common in France and in Europe than it is in the United States. And so in some regards, the model of the listening session of public engagement, of public feedback, up early and upstream in policymaking was innovation for the work that we do, even if it's not for our colleagues in other parts of the world. Typically, the way that we collect information is in a very formal process, feedback from the public, a formal process in which, professional advocates for certain positions write to the government long letters and the like. And in this process, we were asking people just to show up on Zoom and, speak for 2 minutes. We gave people an email address where they could weigh in as well. We really tried to reduce barriers to entry for the American public into the work of policymaking and government. And so let me tell you a little bit about what we heard. We heard from the American public that they were concerned about conclusions that come from government science. They weren't sure that they could or should always trust them. We heard that the American public, more than ever before, is invested in making sure that decisions in government are guided by science, sound science, and technology. And we received thoughtful, innovative ideas about how we can improve our scientific integrity policies and implement new and stronger ones. Restoring trust in government has implications for everything from climate policy to vaccine uptake, existential issues that demand open discussions and vigorous debate. Whether people are challenging policies or rallying around them, they must always have access to the facts, to the information on which they're based. Our strategy is to, and for more equitable science and technology policy, is to endeavor to be honest about the past, reasons for mistrust, policies that have not been successful, and the present to show our work. What is the data, the information, the evidence on which this decision is being made, and to be transparent in our work and encourage others in government to do the same. We are all aware that this has not always been the case in recent years, that there have been lapses in scientific integrity, including some very public examples. It was critical for us in our process to also hear from career-long civil servants and to hear from people who worked at agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the so-called science agencies, but to also connect with other parts of government that aren't known for their use of science or their production of science, but who use evidence and science and technology-based tools. Just a couple of weeks ago, we produced the sort of fruits of this work and we released a landmark first of its kind report, the Scientific Integrity Task Force report. And the report found that although federal agency science is generally sound, that there have been lapses that undermine public trust in science and jeopardize federal scientists and technologists, their morale and their motivation to do their work and to innovate in their work. For example, as a hurricane was nearing landfall in the southeastern part of the United States in 2019, the task force highlighted the fact that then President Trump tweeted information contradicting official forecasts. In another instance, the last administration added a question about citizenship to the 2020 census, overruling Census Bureau demographers, social scientists, statisticians, who cited clear evidence that doing so would depress the response rate from people replying to the census and therefore could jeopardize the quality of the census. So these are two violations that are fairly well known, at least in the United States. And these and other violations really help to inform the task force recommendations, including the importance of best practices that continually reinforce a culture of integrity across the government and a sense of accountability to the American public. The task force also raised some other parallel issues that they thought were really important as we were thinking about scientific integrity policy and practices as living and breathing things that would need to sort of be dynamic and iterate and change over time. So issues that will continue to be addressed include the wide growing use of AI and machine learning across the federal government. How do we think about issues of scientific integrity and of safeguarding from political interference and bias when you're dealing with large dynamic technological systems? How do we support the work of equity and representation in the scientific integrity process? Making sure that every constituency working in science and government has the access that they need to information to do their work and feel comfortable, dissenting and speaking about their work. And how do we think about new and emerging modes of science, such as citizen science and community-based science, which have tremendous potential for strengthening and building public trust in science? So how can we think about the intersection between that and the responsibility of upholding scientific integrity in government? So this work has made it clear that now is the time to really inject new urgency into the work of scientific integrity and to make sure that the public can always see where information comes from, and with the hope of beginning to restore trust in the findings and the policy that proceed from that. So that work of implementation is just getting underway. But even as we pursue those changes, we also need to acknowledge another major force causing people to lose faith and trust in science and government. That is technology, which for all its promise has given more people more reasons to be distrustful. We've been listening to a wide range of stakeholders about the impact of emerging technologies as well as scientific integrity. We've brought to the table people and communities who are rarely in the room where devices are programmed, where algorithms are written, and where inputs are made, but who are forced to live with those outputs nevertheless. And we've asked those individuals and many others from industry, from business, from civil society to share their experiences with us at the White House. And we've been talking to this wide array of groups, and there's been a kind of striking consistency across sectors. Time and again, we hear about people who have fallen victim to discrimination at the hands of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We've heard from communities who point to the fact that injustices can be baked into these technologies by negligence or even by design. We've learned a great deal from all of these candid conversations with scientists, with business professionals, with advocates, and with communities. But above all else, these discussions have laid bare a kind of vast architecture of bias and discrimination. The bottom line is that technology has the power to open, expand freedom, expand liberties, and to alleviate injustice. But too often it compounds bias and deepens inequality. And so we must be intentional in the sort of democratic values that we want technology to have. We cannot assume that those values will issue forth from the tools themselves. There's a gap between our values and our technology, and some people suffer as a result of this, and this simply will not do. At the same time, as is the case with so many issues in our interconnected world, we're obviously not the only country contending with these new and complex challenges. Every society on the planet is learning to navigate this new technological and moral landscape. We can learn from each other, and we can also ensure that some of our oldest principles around what it means to have a good society, the common good, are reflected in even our newest technologies. We can be a stronger voice for human rights across the world, even when we are honest about our deficiencies and working actively to fix them in the domain of rights. A government truly in service to the public must confront these structures and these inconsistencies head on. And it's very much what we're trying to do in the Biden-Harris administration. This is a moment, an urgent moment, to make sure that the basic protections of a free society carry over into our digital lives. For far too long, the moral challenges of new technologies have gone unaddressed in the United States. It's time to lay out some rules of the road to articulate a democratic vision for our use of technology. In my office, we've been working on what we're calling an AI Bill of Rights to sort of think about these principles, values, regulations that we think every society should have, or that our society should have with regards to guardrails around technology. These include one shouldn't be singled out for who they are or what they believe. That one should be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures in our day-to-day lives. And that these guardrails and protections, even if aspirational, must carry over into our digital lives. Basic rights and responsibilities of life should carry over into the world of artificial intelligence, and there should be safeguards against bias and discrimination. So we are working to build, an American society and also a global society, working with the EU and others, where innovation happens without predation, where protections are baked in from the beginning in a way that actually allows innovation, where marginalized communities have a voice in the development process and in the science and technology research and development process, where science and technology developers or designers and scientists are working hard to ensure that the benefits of their work reach all people. And we have been turning to the public to help us think through this, in addition to lots of engaged, dedicated civil servants and policymakers. So these are, I think, big and necessary changes in society, but also in how we think about doing the work of government. How do we want to think about governing and creating policy with publics in a context of low trust? How do we think through that? How do we close the trust gap that has widened in recent years while still addressing the moral injustices of history? And that kind of tightrope walk is what's required of us as we face the unique challenges of this century and of this generation. This is the work and the vision in part of the Biden-Harris administration. An approach to innovation that is rooted in equity, integrity, and our common humanity. We have before us an extraordinary window of opportunity, a chance to take this moment of possible peril of all sorts, crises, which I know that we will talk about, and turn them into possibility. It's going to require us to be willing, in some instances, to write a new social contract, not just for this moment, but for the decades that lie ahead. This is a chance to ensure that the public is engaged in the everyday work of government and sees their needs addressed in our decisions. In many ways, this kind of public engagement, as I said before, is de rigueur in Europe. But in the United States, we are taking steps to also uplift this approach to our work. No matter the challenge, we need to keep up with our engagement in the public and ensure that our policy processes are always informed by the needs, sentiments, and the lived experiences of the people we represent. We are from safeguarding rights in the age of AI to preventing political interference in science and technology. We are bringing people and communities to the table who are rarely in the rooms where these types of decisions are made. A cohort that represents a diversity of the day-to-day experiences of American life, and that strengthens our efforts as we address the biggest barriers and hurdles of our time. So each of us have a role to play in this work, both in our local communities and in the global society. And I thank each of you for the role that you are playing in this work. I wish you a productive and successful conference. I am very honored and pleased to be with you as the conversation gets underway. And I thank you for inviting me to be here with you this evening.
Merci beaucoup, chère Alondra Nelson. Merci de cette présentation précise de ce que l'administration Biden-Harris tente de promouvoir à travers votre action et l'action de ce bureau pour la science et la technologie. Nous avons pris un tout petit peu de retard, mais ce n'est pas grave. C'était tout à fait passionnant de vous écouter. Je me permettrai donc juste une question pour que vous puissiez un peu approfondir. Vous avez beaucoup travaillé dans le passé en tant que sociologue et vous l'avez rappelé ici, à la façon dont la science pouvait non seulement ne pas régler les problèmes de société, mais parfois en créer, et notamment comment la science pouvait être l'origine de discrimination, notamment de discrimination sociale, de discrimination de genre, de discrimination raciale. Vous avez beaucoup étudié cette question-là dans vos travaux académiques. Et vous avez rappelé l'importance de faire en sorte que un lien de confiance se rétablisse entre les citoyens et les scientifiques et l'administration politique pour que l'on comprenne que la science ne devait pas justement créer des biais discriminatoires. De ce point de vue-là, comment, après cette année d'expérience que vous avez à la Maison Blanche, comment évaluez-vous cette période très particulière de la pandémie dans laquelle nous sommes encore? Quel rôle la science a-t-elle joué dans la façon dont on a pu affronter cette pandémie qui n'est pas d'ailleurs terminée? Est-ce que la science est suffisamment armée pour devenir un outil de confiance dans les politiques de préparation aux crises? Là, une crise pandémique dont on sait que d'autres pourraient suivre, mais on pourrait évidemment penser aux crises climatiques, aux crises environnementales. On insiste souvent sur le fait que les sociétés doivent se préparer à ces crises. C'est une thématique que nous abordons très souvent à l'école urbaine de Lyon. Mais se préparer à ces crises, c'est peut-être aussi trouver un nouveau rôle pour une science plus proche des citoyens et moins suspecte de produire des discriminations ou de capter en quelque sorte tous les bénéfices des innovations technologiques au profit de quelques personnes seulement. Comment avez-vous vécu cela de l'intérieur et quelles sont vos réflexions au moment où nous parlons sur ce rôle de la science dans la préparation possible aux grandes crises que toutes les sociétés ont à affronter en cette période de changement global?
Thank you so much, Michel, for those nice comments. I think it summarized so much of what I was trying to say, and certainly the work that you all are engaged in at the Open School. So I think I would just raise a couple of issues mindful of time. I mean, one is that this moment has been an extraordinary example in how powerful and successful science can be. So, a couple of facts that I often like to mention when I'm talking about the pandemic and the role of social science. One is that in less than a month, we had a genome, the genomic code of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, of the coronavirus. So in less than a month's time, we knew from a genomic level what it was. So we knew quite a lot about this disease, this virus, very early on. Secondly, in less than a year, I think it's 314 days, we had developed the vaccine. This sort of first iteration of the vaccine, that is now being used in our communities and increasingly broadly as we move forward with equitable distribution of the vaccine. But we still were left with social problems and social issues around trust of evidence in government, the debates around anti-vax and around masking mandates in the United States. And so we had sort of, one way of saying this is what I'm trying to say is that we had sort of solved the science problem in the first year. And yet the pandemic sort of continues to animate our lives, in part because the issues that it raised are not only about the vaccine or about having the right genomic sequence for the vaccine for the virus. And so it's been an incredible, I think, object lesson for us in the infrastructure that one needs for public health, for the delivery of government services, for the benefits that people need in times of crisis and stress. And so I think it's really, I hope that this will be a moment for us to learn more about what we've all just been living through or still living through. And social science will be so critical for that. And also to begin to help us sort of figure out where, the other pieces of the puzzle, the ways in which for this particular crisis, the pandemic, the technological and scientific tools alone were insufficient for helping us to stem it. And that means that as we think about pandemic preparedness or preparedness for other crises, for other kinds of disasters, that we need to be thinking about bridges and levees and canals, and various kinds of architecture and infrastructure that we need, for example, to sort of adapt to and mitigate climate crisis, in addition to different ways of eating and different ways of living. But those are not only sort of science and technology, research and innovation questions. And so many of the tools that we will need require us, I think, to think about government that's a government that's willing to include social science, and social science that's not only economics and social, that's not only about experiments, but about people's qualitative experience and lives. And it means using the tools of science, social science, in the work of policy analysis to understand whether or not policies have succeeded or failed. It means making sure that the social sciences and the work of, are able to, I think, at their best, bridge between the academy and the public sphere. And I think, again, and this goes back to my earlier point, it means having honest examination about the fact that science alone, the sort of tools alone, are insufficient, that we need the human piece and the historical piece and the social piece always as a part of efficacious policymaking.
Merci beaucoup de cette réponse et de cette volonté de lier les sciences sociales, les sciences expérimentales, la société tout entière et évidemment l'action politique qui doit permettre à cette société de connaître les meilleures conditions possibles. Je pense que nous traversons une période où les enjeux de science n'ont jamais été aussi importants, sans aucun doute, malgré cette crise de la confiance que vous avez évoquée. Et nous essayons ici à Lyon aussi de trouver de nouvelles voies pour cette science se rapprochant des citoyens de manière à ce que la science inspire de nouveau confiance, parce que peut-être que nous-mêmes, scientifiques, n'avons pas été suffisamment attentifs à ces questions-là dans les décennies précédentes. Et avons-nous peut-être pu donner l'impression que la science était toujours du côté des puissances et des intérêts de quelques-uns avant de servir l'intérêt général. En tout cas, merci d'avoir été là ce soir, Alondra Nelson, pour nous communiquer ces réflexions. Bonne fin de journée à Washington. Hein. Vous avez encore évidemment toute la journée pour continuer le travail. Et ça a été un grand honneur pour nous de vous accueillir ce soir. Et à bientôt, nous l'espérons. Et merci vraiment très chaleureusement de votre participation à cette 4e école de l'Anthropocène. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.